All right, Michael, are you ready to get started?
I think so.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm Stacy Morris with the Missouri Developmental Disabilities Council, and we are super excited that the Mental Health Behavioral Council has brought Michael Dalto to us today. And we're going to talk about two things: using work incentives to pay for work-related expenses, also known as IRWE, and PASS, which is the plan to achieve self-support. I want to be sure everyone is aware there were two attachments that Kelsey sent out. One of them is Michael's presentation in PowerPoint, as well as an SSI calculator tool. And that is in the chat here. If you don't want to open your email, you can just grab it there. But if you can have that handy, that would be great. And because this is continuing education for some people, I want to be sure that you're aware we need attendees to be logged in and viewing the presentation for the full time in order to get that continuing education credit, okay? If you're having any technical difficulties, please feel free to send me a chat and a message, and I'm happy to help if I can. So let's get right to it. Again, we're so excited that Michael Dalto is here because he has over 30 years of experience where he's been training people and giving technical assistance for public benefits and work incentives. He's worked with the state of Missouri to even help develop our benefits planning tiered model. And he has been consulting with tons of organizations, including Cornell. I know some of you have been trained with Cornell as well as the National Federation of the Blind. So we have a great subject matter expert today. And Michael, I'm going to let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Stacy, and it's nice to be here. Um, so when my son was about 11 years old, I remember one day he came home from school and I asked him how his day was, and he said, "Well, I have bad news and I have good news." And I said, "Well, what's the bad news?" And he said, "The bad news is I forgot to do my homework, so I got a zero on it." And I said, "Well, what's the good news?" And he said, "The good news is I don't have cystic fibrosis." So that was my 11-year-old son, the spin doctor. And today we have bad news and good news. The bad news is the rules about how work affects benefits from Social Security can be very complex and confusing. But the good news is I'm going to do my level best to make them as simple and clear as possible. And these rules include safety nets known as work incentives that do two things. They enable people to pay for work-related expenses, and they help ease people's fears about losing benefits. By the way, this is really an intro. This is very basic information for those of you who've had experience with the work incentives and the work rules. This will be a review. But if you have no experience with this stuff, you're also in the right place because I've designed this for beginners. So, two big challenges that workers with disabilities face are being able to pay for expenses that they need for work. The big one that inspired this training is transportation. Huge need, often not funded through other sources. And the other issue is people who get benefits from Social Security, either Social Security Disability or SSI, are often very fearful of losing benefits if they go to work. And if the individual isn't, probably somebody else in their life, a family member, a residential program, etc., may be concerned. But luckily, these safety nets called work incentives can help people overcome both of those barriers at the same time. Work incentives can help fund or offset the cost of work-related items and services that people need. So they are at least a partial funding source for work-related expenses. And as you'll see, this means that individuals can pay for expenses out of pocket and get those expenses at least partially offset. And secondly, the work incentives enable people to keep critical benefits while they're working. In some cases, they can keep at least some of their cash benefits, in many cases, all of them. We'll be talking about both scenarios, and keep their medical benefits, even if they work their way off cash benefits. So by easing people's fears of losing benefits, the work incentives encourage more people to work, to continue working, to increase their earnings. And if at the same time they can pay for expenses they need to work, then we've killed two birds with one stone. So we're going to go through the two different primary cash benefits that people with disabilities receive from Social Security. The first is Social Security Disability Insurance, or SSDI for short. And then we'll move into Supplemental Security Income, or SSI for short. And for each one, I'll be describing the benefit, who's eligible, how much the benefit might be, medical benefit that comes along with it, and then go into the work rules and how work incentives like Impairment Related Work Expenses, or IRWE for short, and Plan to Achieve Self-Support, or PASS for short, how they interact with these benefits. But you'll note one reason that this material can be confusing is that I kind of feel like some bureaucrats probably design the rules intending for them to be confusing. Rule number one for bureaucrats trying to confuse the public is give very different benefits, very similar names. So SSDI and SSI only differ by one letter, but they're very different benefits. And we'll cover them one at a time, starting with Social Security Disability Insurance, or SSDI. So SSDI is a cash benefit that people with disabilities can get from Social Security. They have to have a severe disability that meets Social Security's criteria for disability for adults. And Social Security's criteria are that you have to have a disability that's lasted or is expected to last at least a year, or if it's a terminal illness, and that disability has to limit the person's ability to work. Notice I did not say it has to prevent the person from working completely. That's a myth, and it's a harmful myth that discourages many people from working. A person can be capable of working. In many cases, they can even be working when they apply for SSDI and still be eligible. But their disability does have to limit their ability to work. And they have to have worked and paid Social Security taxes on their earnings long enough to have something called insured status. So if you've worked, you've paid into the system by paying Social Security taxes on your earnings. And we all do that. People who get paychecks, you can look at your pay stubs and see an item. It's often called FICA, which is Federal Insurance Contributions Act. And that's the Social Security payroll tax. That's paying into the Social Security system through earnings. And if a person's paid into the system long enough, then they can have insured status and qualify for SSDI. But a lot of people that we work with get SSDI rather than on their own work record because they've worked and paid Social Security taxes. Instead, they have a parent who worked and paid Social Security taxes on their earnings. If the parent is now getting Social Security retirement benefits, or the parent has a disability and is getting SSDI, or the parent is deceased, then their disabled adult child, who's at least 18 years old and was disabled before they turned 22, can get SSDI on the parent's record. Now, there's also a way to get SSDI on the record of a deceased spouse who, if the surviving spouse has a disability and is at least 50 years old, but that's relatively rare. And so I haven't mentioned it in the PowerPoint here. But many people we work with get SSDI based on their own past work or on a parent's past work. So how much is the SSDI benefit? That depends on how much the worker has earned. Social Security bases the SSDI benefit amount on a formula that starts with the person's average lifetime earnings. So Social Security will look at the person's earnings throughout their lifetime. They adjust them for inflation, and they figure out the person's average monthly earnings throughout their lifetime. Then they plug that into a formula. And the higher the person's average monthly earnings, the higher their SSDI benefit will be. The maximum SSDI benefit this year is over $3,600. But to get that much, people typically have to have worked a number of years earning a six-figure salary. The average SSDI benefit is much lower. It's $1,483 a month. But that's still significantly higher than the maximum SSI benefit that we'll get to a little later. So on the average, SSDI benefits are greater than SSI benefits, but there are exceptions. So SSDI comes with a medical benefit, which is Medicare. But there's a downside. The person has to be entitled to SSDI for 2 years before their Medicare will start. So there is a waiting period to get Medicare. Okay, and then we'll move into the work rules. I did want to pause and say, please feel free to type any questions or comments in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye out for them, and I'm happy to stop and answer questions at any point. And I will have some questions for you, and we'll be asking you to type answers into the chat when we get to them. And I hope many of you will do that. So if a person gets SSDI, oh, wait a minute, got something in the chat. Okay, thank you, Stacy, for keeping an eye on the chat. So when a person gets SSDI and they start paid work for the first time, they get something called a trial work period. And that's a period of 9 months in which they can earn any amount and still keep their full SSDI benefit. So a trial work period is a great safety net because it lets a person try out work and earn unlimited amounts from work and still keep their full SSDI benefit. But after the trial work period ends, then Social Security starts to look at a person's earnings, and they're looking at whether the person's earnings are something called substantial gainful activity, or SGA for short, which is a really important concept in SSDI. When a person first applies for SSDI, they have to have a disability that's considered to be severe enough that it prevents them from doing substantial gainful activity, or SGA. That's what I meant when I said the disability has to limit the person's ability to work. Now, if the person after their trial work period is working and their work is not considered to be SGA, then they'll be able to keep their full SSDI benefit. And if their earnings stay below that SGA amount indefinitely, they'll keep their full SSDI benefit indefinitely. So what does SGA mean? How much would a person need to earn to be doing SGA and possibly have their SSDI stop? Well, there is a dollar amount attached to SGA. So if a person earns at least a certain dollar amount, they may be doing SGA, but not necessarily. There are ways people can earn more, sometimes a lot more than the SGA dollar amount, but still not be doing SGA. And I'll explain that in a moment. So in 2023, the SGA dollar amount for people who are not blind by Social Security's definition is $1,470 a month, gross wages. Or if the person's self-employed, $1,470 a month net self-employment income. That would mean the gross revenue from their business minus the business expenses the person pays for. All right. So how much is $1,470 a month? Well, let's say the person is earning $12 an hour. If a person earned $12 an hour, they'd have to be working a little more than 28 hours a week to earn $1,470 a month. Now, if a person meets Social Security's definition of blindness, then the SGA dollar amount is $2,460 a month, almost $1,000 a month higher. And that's because historically, blind people had the best lobby of any disability group in the country. And so there are more advantageous rules for people who are blind. And to look at $2,460 a month, if we again take $12 an hour, a person would actually have to be working over 47 hours a week in order at $12 an hour in order to earn $2,460 a month. And of course, if they were working 47 hours a week, they would be getting overtime. But it's a significantly higher SGA dollar amount. But if a person earns $1,470 a month or more and they're not blind, that does not necessarily mean they're doing SGA. And here's why. Because when Social Security figures out if a person is doing SGA, if their earnings are above the SGA dollar amount, Social Security is supposed to look at certain subtractions from earnings that a person is allowed, and they look at the amount that remains after the subtractions. And if the remaining amount after subtractions is below the SGA dollar amount, then the person will almost definitely, with rare exceptions, be considered to be not doing SGA and will keep their full SSDI. So it's not just the amount of earnings the person has. What's more important is the earnings minus the subtractions. You look at the amount that's left over after the subtractions. If that's below the SGA dollar amount, then the person will not be doing SGA and will keep their full SSDI. So the subtractions are a way that people can earn more than they thought and still keep their full SSDI. By the way, the SGA dollar amounts generally go up each year. They never go down. There have been a few years when they've stayed the same, but usually they go up each year. And in periods of higher inflation, they go up more significantly. SGA, for example, for a non-blind person in 2022 was $1,350. So it went up $120 in 2023. Okay, and Jennifer asks, if an adult child is determined ineligible for a childhood disability benefit, CDB is the kind of SSDI that a child can get, or disabled adult child can get on their parent's record. So if an adult child is determined ineligible for that benefit on one parent's work record, say because the adult child got married, can they later try to reapply for the benefit if they're no longer married? If yes, can they reapply under the same parent, or do they have to reapply under the other parent's Social Security number? Jennifer, you've clearly got background in this material, and I'd be happy to answer that question later after we finish, if you don't mind sticking around. But it's really rather advanced, and I don't want to throw us off track with beginners. So it's a good question. It's certainly one I'd like to answer, but I'd like to hold off until we're done with the rest of the training, if you don't mind. Thanks. Okay, so moving on, what kinds of subtractions does Social Security allow to figure out if somebody is doing SGA? Well, if a person is employed rather than self-employed, there are two subtractions from earnings that are used. First one is called subsidy, and the second one is called impairment related work expenses, excuse me, or IRWE for short. So what are these? A subsidy means a worker is paid the full wage for their job, but they're not technically earning all that they're paid because their productivity is lower than the average non-disabled worker because of their disability. For example, they're working more slowly than a non-disabled worker. They're not able to fully perform all of the job tasks because of their disability, or they're getting extra help to do the job. That could be from a coworker, a supervisor, or a job coach, or some combination of those people. So there's a way to calculate a dollar amount for a subsidy and subtract it from the person's earnings. And that's one of the subtractions that's allowed. I'm not going to go into detail about subsidy because our primary focus is on impairment related work expenses. Excuse me, a subsidy doesn't help a person pay for work related expenses, but impairment related work expenses, or IRWEs, will. So I'm going to focus more on IRWEs. So an IRWE is an expense that the worker with a disability pays for out of their own pocket, and they're not reimbursed for. The expense has to be needed due to their disability or another medical condition they have. And the expense has to be needed at least partly for work. It's actually a fourth condition, which is the person is paying a reasonable amount, like a market rate for the expense. But that's usually the case. The three conditions on slide 11 are the most important to know. So what are some examples of impairment-related work expenses? Medications, medical services, medical supplies and devices, transportation for work if it's needed because of the person's disability. So, for example, if a person is unable to drive themselves because of their disability, they couldn't get a driver's license, for example, or they could not drive a standard vehicle, then they may be able to use transportation expenses as an IRWE, such as paratransit. That's clearly disability related. You have to have a disability to be able to use paratransit. Uber, Lyft, paid rides from a friend. So if a person's unable to drive due to their disability, they pay someone else to drive them to and from work. That could be an IRWE. If a person has a disability a physical disability that requires them to have a modified vehicle, like hand controls or a wheelchair lift on the vehicle, the cost of the vehicle modifications could be an IRWE. And work-related mileage on a modified vehicle is also allowed as an IRWE. So if a person is driving to and from work in a modified vehicle, and maybe they've got other work-related mileage, they make deliveries, they visit clients, etc., then the mileage for all work-related activities is also allowed as an IRWE at the IRS mileage rate, currently 65.5 cents per mile. Okay, Amber asks, do copays and deductibles count as an IRWE? And Amber, it's a great question. And the answer is yes, they do. So if a person, say, has insurance that covers some of an expense, but not all of it. So maybe the person has to pay for an expense, maybe the first few $100s a year as a deductible. A deductible is the portion of an expense that a person usually has to pay up front before their insurance starts paying anything, or co-insurance or co-pays. That means the insurance is paying a portion of the expense, but the individual has to pay the rest. The portion that the individual pays that was not reimbursed through another source, like the insurance, would be allowed as an IRWE. So let's say that a person has a medical expense that they need to pay for that's needed at least partly for work. So let's say it's some type of medical device, and without that medical device, they could not work, even though they'd need that medical device for their daily life outside of work as well. If it's needed at least partly for work, it could be an IRWE. And let's say that that expense was $1,000 and insurance paid 80% of it, or $800. The individual paid the other $200 and was not reimbursed for that. The $200 that the individual paid and was not reimbursed for could be allowed as an impairment-related work expense. So thank you. It was a great question, Amber. Other examples: assistive technology, including repairs, maintenance, and training to use them. Job coaching, most people don't pay for job coaching, but I've worked with some people who did, including people who paid for coworker support, paid a coworker to essentially be their job coach. Attendance services, if they're needed to help the person prepare for work, or if they're needed on the job. Home modifications, say you need to pay for a ramp to get in and out of your house to be able to work. Service animal expenses, prosthetic devices. if a person lives in a residential program and they're paying a cost of care, they're paying for a portion of staff costs for their services. To the extent that staff are helping the person prepare for work, at least a portion of the payments for that cost of care would be allowed as an impairment-related work expense. So, wide variety of expenses. What you'll notice is that all the examples of expenses I listed would be related to a disability or a medical condition. And if they're also needed at least partly for work, and the worker pays for them and is not reimbursed, or at least pays for a portion of them and is not reimbursed, then those expenses could be used as IRWEs. So let's go through an example. So here's Corey, who gets SSDI, and she's not blind. So first, I have a question for you. If you recall, what would the SGA dollar amount be for Corey if she's not blind? What's the monthly SGA dollar amount for a non-blind person? And just feel free to go ahead and type into the chat. Okay, we've got several people answering $1,470 a month. And that is correct. Okay, and Stacy asked, what would the SGA dollar amount be for Corey if she's not blind? Okay. Yes, and it's $1,470 a month. So Corey used up her trial work period last year, so that's over with. Now Social Security is looking at whether her earnings are SGA. She gets a new job earning $12 an hour and working 35 hours a week. So this gives her average gross wages of $1,820 a month. That's $12 an hour times 35 hours per week, multiplied by 4 1/3 weeks per month, 4.333 weeks per month. We usually think of a month having 4 weeks, but it's actually on average more than 4 weeks. It's 4 1/3 weeks in an average month. So with earnings of $1,820 a month, Corey may be doing SGA because she's earning over $1,470 a month. But Corey is unable to drive due to her disability, and she pays $300 a month for Uber to go to and from work. She pays $80 a month for co-pays for psychotherapy and medications. So which of these expenses do you think could be allowed as IRWEs? We're assuming that Corey is paying for the full cost of all of the expenses. So if you could go ahead and type into the chat, which of the expenses could be allowed as impairment-related work expenses? Okay, and most people are saying both, and that's correct. The expenses, the Uber and the co-pays would clearly be disability related. Corey has to pay for Uber because she's unable to drive due to her disability. Even if she had a car, she couldn't drive it because of her disability. And the co-pays for psychotherapy and medications are clearly disability related. Definitely, she needs Uber for work. That's her transportation to and from work. And it's likely she could make the case very easily that she needs psychotherapy and medications to treat her disability to enable her to work. So both expenses are disability related and work related. And since she pays for them out of pocket and isn't reimbursed, they would meet all three conditions as impairment related work expenses. Okay. And Ruth asks, what if she had SSI instead of SSDI? Good question, Ruth. And we will get to SSI when we're finished with SSDI. And in fact, a person can use IRWE when they get SSI, but they use it in a different way. Jordan asks, is the 9-month trial work period per job or just once? It's a very good question. The 9-month trial period happens once. And unless the person has their SSDI terminated and then gets it back again later, they would only get one trial work period in the lifetime. Trial work period is more detailed than I'm providing information about now, because our primary focus is using work incentives to fund employment supports. But there is certainly more detail about the trial work period. I just wanted you to be aware of it and give you a very basic definition of it. But I'm not going into deeper detail about it now. Shay asks, if she owned a car, but someone else drove her, could she use gas receipts? Okay, so if Corey owned a car and she paid somebody else to drive her to and from work because she was unable to drive herself due to her disability, then the expense of having someone else drive her to and from work could potentially be allowed as an IRWE. There are limitations if that someone else was a family member. There are some restrictions there. But if the person was not a family member and drove her to and from work, then the fee that she would be paying that person to drive her could be allowed as an IRWE. Saving gas receipts, it's generally not something people do. Usually what they do is look at the mileage based on the IRS mileage rate. That's a lot easier to track than keeping receipts for gas and maintenance and repairs and things like that. But yeah, if you own a car, but you can't drive it and someone else drives you to and from work, then the cost of having that other person drive you may be allowed as an IRWE. Yeah, Daniel's going into a more detailed explanation of the trial work period. And I'm not going to do that right now because that really could throw us off track. I apologize that I'm not going into deeper details, but I really did want to focus on work incentives as a funding source for work-related expenses. Okay, so we've established that Corey's SGA dollar amount is $1,470 a month, but both the expenses, Uber and the copays, would be allowed as IRWEs. So her gross wages of $1,820 a month are over SGA of $1,470 a month. But now, after subtracting her IRWEs of $300 for Uber and $80 for copays, what would the remaining amount be? So after those subtractions, what's left over, which is called her countable income? 1,820 minus 380. And several people are answering 1,440, which is correct. All right. So her countable income, the amount that remains after subtracting the IRWEs, is $1,440 a month. The SGA dollar amount, remember, was $1,470. So with countable income, remaining amount after subtractions, of $1,440 a month, would Corey be doing SGA? That'd be SGA or not? That's just a yes or no. Okay, and people are answering no, which is correct because 1,440 is less than 1,470. So even though Corey's gross wages are well over 1,470 a month, her countable income after subtractions is lower than the 1,470 SGA dollar amount. So that means she's not doing SGA. And the final question is, if she's not doing SGA, what will happen to her SSDI? Will it stop or will it continue? Okay, and everyone who's answered has said it will continue, and that's correct. That's the beauty of IRWE, is it lets a person earn more than the SGA dollar amount, but if they have enough subtractions to keep their countable income below SGA, then they can keep their full SSDI benefit while working. Okay, and Sandy types, please keep in mind that if you do not have the expertise to be a benefits planner, meaning training and certification from Cornell or Virginia Commonwealth University, these are examples where you may want to refer someone to a benefits planner. As someone without that expertise, we would just want to be aware of how IRWEs can help someone and be on the lookout for potential opportunities. Absolutely, Sandy. I love that. Thank you. I am going to be talking at the end of the presentation about how you can refer someone to a benefits planner to get detailed help with this stuff. But you're absolutely right, Sandy. The idea of this training is to be aware of rules like impairment-related work expenses, so that if you're working with someone who may be able to use them, you can reinforce the message that a benefits planner will provide in deeper detail and let a person know that they may be able to earn more than they thought and still keep their SSDI. All right, so you have answered all of the questions on slide 15, and the answers appear on slide 16. So what does IRWE really do for a worker who gets SSDI? Well, as I mentioned, IRWE, along with subsidy, if a person uses a subsidy, can enable them to keep their full SSDI benefit even if their earnings are above the SGA dollar amount, $1,470 a month, if the person is not blind. This is important because it means the person can earn more than they thought they could, most likely. Can earn more than $1,470 a month if they're not blind. And that means a person can work more hours. How many people have you ever worked with who got SSDI and said, I can't work more than 20 hours a week, or however many hours they thought they could work, or I'm going to lose my SSDI? And how many of those people had employers who wanted them to work more hours, or maybe even insisted that they work more hours to keep the job? And if they refused, they could lose the job. What about workers who keep their earnings below the SGA dollar amount, but then get a raise? If that would mean they'd either cut back on their hours or quit their jobs to keep their SSDI. Using these subtractions, particularly IRWE, a person may be able to keep their full SSDI even if their earnings increase. At the same time, IRWE enables a person to pay for expenses needed for work because of their disability or another medical condition out of their pocket and still keep SSDI. So they can earn more money from work and use the extra money above the SGA dollar amount to pay for those impairment-related work expenses. So now obviously this eases people's fears of losing SSDI. If they can earn more than the SGA dollar amount, but pay for IRWEs to keep their countable income below SGA and keep their SSDI, then people are much more willing to work or earn higher amounts or have their earnings or hours increase. So what if a worker is earning over the SGA dollar amount and they're using IRWEs and possibly subsidy as subtractions, and their countable income, even after all the subtractions, is still more than the SGA dollar amount? What happens then? Well, then they get a 3-month grace period. And if their countable earnings stay over SGA at that point, their SSDI payments would stop. It's important to know that SSDI is an all or nothing benefit. If your earnings are below SGA, your countable earnings are below SGA, you keep the full SSDI. If your countable earnings are SGA or above, after the trial work period and the grace period, then your SSDI stops. It's not just reduced, it stops. But there are some work incentives that provide important protections for people in that situation who are doing SGA even after subtractions. There are a couple of work incentives that let people keep their Medicare even if they work their way off SSDI. They can keep their Medicare indefinitely. And there are a couple of work incentives that will let a person get their SSDI back if they've worked their way off it, and then their earnings later drop low enough, their countable earnings go below SGA, or they stop working, they can get the SSDI back without having to reapply and start all over. They provide a quicker, easier way to get SSDI back rather than having to reapply. So those are really important to know about. The details are beyond the scope of this training, but it is important for you to know that if you work with people who do work their way off SSDI, they have safety nets to keep their medical benefit indefinitely and to be able to get their cash benefit, their SSDI, back without having to reapply if something happens to their earnings later. All right, so I'm going to pause for a moment here, see if there are any questions, comments. Sandy says, for those who are not benefits planners, it's important for us to not assume that everyone who receives Social Security is receiving SSDI. It's always a good practice to confirm benefits before providing any guidance about how earnings will impact a person's benefits. Very important. It's difficult for a lot of people to know which benefit they get. SSDI and SSI are only one letter different. A lot of people have no idea which benefit they get. Even worse, some people are certain which benefit they get, but they're wrong. They don't get the benefit that they think they get. So a benefit planner, who you'd be referring people to, will, before they start providing any benefits planning, will get official verification of the benefit or benefits that the person receives. And that can enable you to reinforce the message that the benefit planner provides. So this information is for you to use, not to tell people, well, you're getting benefits from Social Security, you can use IRWEs and stay below SGA, because it's possible the person may be getting SSI instead of SSDI. So the benefit does need to be verified, and a benefit planner can do that. And Shay says, and to make it more confusing, some people get both SSDI and SSI. And that's true too. We'll get to that in a moment. Let's see. Becky says, and remember that it takes us benefit planners a bit of time to get the BPQI, that's short for Benefits Planning Query. That's the document that verifies which benefit or benefits a person gets. And that can take some time. Daniel adds, can IRWEs and subsidies be applied retroactively? For instance, in a situation where someone loses their SSDI check for going over SGA, but then drops back below SGA after providing information about IRWEs and subsidies after this happens. Yeah, this is a really good point, Daniel. Sometimes Social Security will stop a person's SSDI because they were not aware that the person could use IRWEs or subsidy. And that's often because the individual wasn't aware that they could use those work incentives. So if their benefits stopped because Social Security said they did SGA, but then later maybe the person got hooked up with a benefits planner who said, oh, you would have qualified for IRWEs and subsidies. The person could appeal, or if they've missed the deadline for appeal, they can ask Social Security to reopen the decision, and the IRWEs and subsidies can be applied retroactively, as Daniel asked. And honestly, I think Daniel knew the answer to that question, but it is a good point to know that sometimes people can use these work incentives to fix a problem that's already happened. So if you work with people who've already had their SSDI stop, they should absolutely be referred to a benefit planner, because it's possible that they may be able to use those work incentives retroactively, maybe get their benefits back even retroactively. Sandy says there's a time limit to how far back the work incentives can be used. For SSDI, it's 4 years after the fact, 4 years after the date on the notice that said the person's benefits would be stopping, right? Aaron says, if you have a Social Security office in your area, you should be able to make an appointment and get the BPQI benefits planning query on site. Check before you go, because they may have specific releases they need to have signed in order to release that information. I've found this cuts down on the time to receive the BPQI information. Just a thought. Yes. Yeah, that's all true. But I'm going to get back. Again, this is a beginner presentation, and we're going to move on now to SSI, Supplemental Security Income. So SSI has some things in common with SSDI, but also some big differences. So like SSDI, SSI is a cash benefit that a person gets from Social Security. Also, like SSDI, a person has to have a severe disability that meets Social Security's definition of disability. Although that definition is different for children under 18 than it is for adults 18 or older. But I'm assuming that we're going to be focused on adults, that you're working with almost exclusively or exclusively with people 18 or older. Now, a person can get SSI even if they don't have a disability, if they're at least 65 years old. But I'm assuming that, for our purposes, we're looking at people who are getting SSI based on disability. But that's where the similarity ends. Cash benefit based on disability for most people. If you're disabled enough to get SSDI, you're disabled enough to get SSI. But for SSI, it's not based on earnings, on having worked and paid Social Security taxes on earnings. Instead, it's based on financial need. You have to have income and assets, which Social Security calls resources, below certain limits. You don't have to have worked a day in your life to qualify for SSI, but you have to have low income and low resources. So first of all, what's the difference between income and resources or assets? I have a trainer friend who likes to say, income is what you get and resources are what you got. So if you receive money in one calendar month, it counts as income that month. If you have any of that money left over when the next calendar month begins, the portion that's still remaining is called a resource. And it remains a resource as long as you have it. So if you receive income of $1,000 in one calendar month, it counts against the income limit that month. Let's say you spend all but $200 of it. And when the very next month begins, you've got $200 left over. That $200 becomes a resource and would remain a resource for as long as the person had it until they spent it. Now, not all resources count. We'll get into that in a little bit. But money is income in the month you get it, and any amount that carries over into the next month becomes a resource. Okay. And Amber asks, on SSI, do you get a 9-month trial period with a new job like with SSDI? Yeah, Amber, we will get to the SSI rules momentarily. And I can tell you, over 40 years ago, the SSDI and SSI work rules were very much alike. The SSI work rules were very much like the current SSDI work rules. But SSI work rules have changed and improved a lot more than SSDI work rules have. So there's actually no trial work period for SSI. We'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so this is who's eligible for SSI. Now, what are the income and resource limits? So a person's countable income, you've heard that term countable income before. It's figured a little differently for SSI than for SSDI. Person's countable income, if they're not married, has to be under $914 a month. And a married couple's countable income has to be under, excuse me, $1,371 a month. The resource limits for a single person, unmarried person, their countable resources have to be under 2,000. For a married couple, their countable resources have to be under 3,000. Now, examples of resources that count would be cash, bank accounts, stocks, bonds, CDs, money markets, other investments, real estate a person owns other than the home they live in. But there are resources that do not count. And that includes the home the person lives in, one car, ABLE accounts, special accounts owned by people with disabilities. The first $100,000 a person saves in their ABLE account does not count as a resource for SSI. and special needs trust, special accounts set up to benefit a person with a disability. But the person with a disability does not own the account and does not control the money. So those are all examples of resources that don't count against the $2,000 limit. Sandy says, interestingly enough, I recently saw an article that legislators are exploring legislation to increase the resource limit for SSI recipients. Hasn't passed yet, but it looks like they're talking about this. That is true, Sandy. And I apologize for being cynical about this, but there have been many attempts over recent decades by Congress. They've introduced many bills that would have increased the income and resource limits and made other improvements that have not passed. But hope springs eternal. And thank you for the link to the article about that, excuse me, about that bill before Congress, Sandy. So how much is the SSI amount? I mentioned earlier that generally SSI amounts are lower than SSDI amounts. Not always, but on average, SSDI pays more than SSI. The maximum SSI benefit for a single person is only $914 a month, and for a married couple, it's only $1,371 a month. The average SSDI benefit is over $1,400 a month. So SSI on average pays less than SSDI. So there's a logic to the SSI program. SSI is designed to make sure that eligible people have at least a basic minimum amount of income to pay for food and shelter. So the logic is, well, if you don't have any other income besides SSI, generally you should get the full amount of SSI. If you're single, that'd be $914 a month, because you need all of it to pay for food and shelter. And, you know, for those of us who have decent jobs, it's hard to imagine paying for your food and shelter with only $914 a month. Got no other income, then you should definitely get that $914 a month in most cases. But if you have other income, the theory of SSI is, well, if you've got other income to help pay for food and shelter, then you don't need as much SSI. So the relationship between SSI and other income is like a balance or a scale or a seesaw. If your other income goes up, your SSI goes down. But the reverse is also true. If your other income goes down, your SSI generally goes up. And that logic is helpful when we get into the impact of work on SSI and the SSI work incentives. So let's see. Shay asked, when a teenager who has SSI still lives at home and is working, do the SSI resource limits apply to their parents as well? Yeah, Shay, if the teenager is under 18 years old, then we've got a more complicated situation where a portion of their parents' income and their parents' resources counts against the teen's SSI. And their parents' income and resources could cause the teen to have a lower amount of SSI or zero SSI. But that's definitely beyond the scope of this training. So when a person gets SSI and they go to work, they're doing paid work, their earnings from work will reduce their SSI. Remember, as other income goes up, SSI goes down. But the SSI is not reduced dollar for dollar by earned income. It's reduced by less than half of the person's earnings from work. So yes, when their earnings go up, their SSI will go down, but their income from the earnings will be going up faster than their SSI goes down, because the SSI only goes down a little, less than half the amount of their earnings. As a result, their net income is higher. They have more money if they work than if they don't work, even though their SSI is being reduced, because it's not dollar for dollar. And I wanted to demonstrate the SSI calculation sheet. And if you don't already have this open, please go ahead and take the time to open this document. It's really helpful for estimating the impact of work on SSI benefits. And you should have received this through email, and also Stacy kindly attached it as a document in the chat a little earlier. And I'm going to pull up the document myself. Okay, and I want to be sure that this SSI calculation 2023 document is showing up on the screen now. Can anybody just type something into the chat to let me know? Okay, great. Thank you, Jessica. So this calculation is used to figure out how much of a person's other income besides SSI is countable, and how much their SSI will be reduced, and therefore how much their net income before taxes will be. So the first section of this spreadsheet concerns unearned income, not SSI. SSI itself doesn't count as income in the SSI calculation, but other income like SSDI, or unemployment benefits, interest, dividends, things like that, would count as unearned income. We'll get back to that a little later. The other kind of income appearing on line 8 is earned income. That's only money that a person receives as direct compensation for work they've done. Wages, self-employment income, tips, salaries, royalties if they sell a movie script, something like that. Those would be examples of earned income. Now, there are some work incentives in here that we will not be covering in detail, but they are part of the SSI calculation. There's one for students under age 22 called the student earned income exclusion. We won't be covering that today. We will be covering IRWE, impairment related work expenses, shows up on line 15. I will be mentioning on line 18, but not covering in detail, something called blind work expenses, or BWE. A person has to be blind by Social Security's definition to use that work incentive. Another more advantageous rule for blind people. And then down on line 24, plan to achieve self-support or pass, which we will be using. The spreadsheet figures out a person's countable income, which will appear on line 26, and then it subtracts their total countable income from the SSI base rate. For most unmarried people, that starts out at $914 a month, and then their total countable income is subtracted from that, and that determines what their reduced SSI payment will be. At the very bottom of the spreadsheet, it determines net pre-tax income, takes any unearned income the person gets, adds their earned income, adds their SSI payment, and subtracts their work-related expenses. And the bottom line would be their net pre-tax income. So that's a quick walk through this spreadsheet. Now let's do an example. Let's say an individual gets SSI. They start out with $914 a month, and now they start working. And their gross wages that they're receiving in a month are $1,085, $1,085. So please do this along with me on your own SSI calculation sheet. Go to line 8, the earned income line. All of your data entry goes in column B where the dollar signs are. So put your cursor on line 8 under column B and enter 1085 for $1,085 a month gross wages for earned income. So what does the spreadsheet do? On line 11, it subtracts $20. That's called the general income exclusion. That gets subtracted once a month from income. If a person had unearned income, the $20 would come off that. If they have only earned income, the $20 is subtracted from the earned income. Then down on line 13, it subtracts an earned income exclusion, which is $65 a month. That leaves a remainder on line 14 of $1,000. Then comes the best part. Then the spreadsheet subtracts half of the remainder. So it brings the countable income down from 1,000 to 500. Countable earned income is 500 a month. That would be their total countable income on line 26, since this person had no unearned income. Then that means they're going to get $414 of SSI on line 30. Took the 914 they started out with on line 28, subtracted their $500 of countable income. Their SSI payment is $414 a month. So they're paid $1,085 gross wages per month. Their SSI goes down to $414 a month, but they've got more money. Their net pre-tax income on the very bottom line, line 37, is $1,499 a month because they had $1,085 earned income on line 33 plus 414 SSI on line 34 for total income of $1,499. And in this example, this person wasn't paying for work-related expenses. And that so their net pre-tax income is $1,499 a month. Even after any tax they'd pay on their earnings, they're still going to have a lot more than $914 a month of net income, which is all they had when they were getting just SSI. Sandy says, for those who are not benefits planners, please note that SSI is always 2 months behind. So a person's SSI received on September 1st would be based on income received in July. And that is generally true, Sandy, unless the person's income in July was high enough to reduce their SSI to zero, then it would be reduced to zero in July. Just one of the confusing rules that Social Security uses. So that's a basic example with the SSI calculation. But we're going to be using this again for examples with IRWE and PASS. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize that. And is the PowerPoint now showing up, or are you still seeing?
We'll see the Excel sheet.
Still see the Excel sheet. Okay. Let me stop sharing a moment. And okay, is the
There we go.
PowerPoint showing up again?
Yes, sir.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, so impairment-related work expenses, IRWEs, can be used for a person on SSI, but they're used differently than for a person on SSDI. A person on SSI uses IRWE to subtract from their earned income so that their countable earned income goes down. Remember, when countable income goes down, SSI goes up. And that's what happens with IRWE. So IRWEs are subtracted from countable earnings, and that causes SSI to go up. So in an example, Langston starts out with the maximum SSI of $914 a month. He's not blind. He starts a job that pays him $1,085 a month gross wages. He's not able to drive due to his disability and needs to pay a neighbor $200 a month to drive him to and from work. So what you can do is take the spreadsheet you already filled in 1,085 earned income on, and now you can insert a $200 impairment related work expense on that sheet. A moment to get it back up. Okay, so if he's paying $200 a month for impairment related work expenses, that's going to go on line 15 in column B. Before we enter it, though, remember that without using IRWE and without paying $200 for that expense, his net pre-tax income was $1,499 a month. Now, with a $200 IRWE, which you're going to enter on line 15, column B or column 2, enter $200. What happens is his SSI payment, instead of being $414 a month, goes up to $514. And his net pre-tax income is $1,399 a month. Now, let's see, question in the chat. Okay, you're seeing the calculation sheet. Good, you should be. Joshua asks, does documentation need to be saved for IRWE related expenses? Yes, it does, Joshua, and that's something a benefits planner will help individuals with. Documenting IRWEs with receipts, sometimes with proof that an expense is needed because of the disability or a medical condition, or that it's needed for work. And as Sandy had typed into the chat earlier, it is important for people to report their earnings so that it's less likely that Social Security will overpay them, will give them benefits or benefit amounts that are more than they should have received. Okay, so what did the IRWE do for Langston? It was a $200 IRWE. He paid $200. He got to keep $100 more SSI than he had without the IRWE. He gets 514 rather than 414. He pays 200 for the IRWE. He gets to keep 100 extra SSI. That's the way IRWE usually works. It offsets up to half the amount of an expense. So Langston paid $200 for the IRWE. He got to keep half of that, $100 extra SSI to offset half of the expense. Now, his net pre-tax income goes down from $14.99 a month to $13.99 a month. But how much would his net pre-tax income be if he paid $200 for an expense, but did not use it as an IRWE? How much would his net pre-tax income be then? If anyone could type that into the chat. So if he was paying $200 a month, but wasn't using it as an IRWE, what would his net pre-tax income be? All right. In the interest of time, I'll tell you it would be $1,299 a month, because his net pre-tax income without using IRWE and without paying for an IRWE, remember, was $1,499 a month. If he spent $200 a month of that and didn't have IRWE, his net income would go down by $200 a month. It would go down to $1,299. With IRWE, his net income is $1,399 a month. So it is a bit higher than it would be if he paid $200 for an expense, but did not use IRWE. Back to our PowerPoint. All right. So we've already answered these questions. I'm moving on to slide 30. So how does IRWE work for SSI? It typically offsets up to half the amount of an expense. As we saw in the example with Langston, if you pay $200 a month for an IRWE, you usually get to keep $100 more SSI than you would get without the IRWE. So IRWE partially offsets the expense, but not dollar for dollar. Now, IRWEs are defined the same way for SSI as they are for SSDI. Expense has to be needed for work, at least partly for work, needed because of the disability or another medical condition, paid for out of pocket and not reimbursed, paid for out of pocket by the worker. And the kinds of examples of IRWEs are exactly the same as the ones we looked at for SSDI. Now, if a person on SSI is blind, they have their own work incentive called blind work expenses, or BWEs for short. That's really beyond the scope of this training, but I did want you to be aware that if you work with anybody who meets Social Security's definition of blindness and they get SSI, they can use BWEs. They can deduct almost any work-related expense, even if it's not related to blindness or any disability or medical condition. So that's much more expansive than IRWE. Almost any work-related expense can be subtracted as a blind work expense. And BWE usually offsets 100% of an out-of-pocket expense. So if Langston were blind and he could use blind work expenses rather than impairment-related work expenses, when he paid $200 a month for the expense, IRWE would let him get $200 extra SSI, keep $200 extra SSI. So it's more advantageous than IRWE. But of course, you have to be blind to use it. And Kara asks, how does a client on SSI report or document their IRWEs? Is there an app or website as there is for income reporting? Well, Kara, this is something that a benefits planner would do with the individual. They do need to keep receipts. In some cases, if it's not abundantly obvious that an expense is disability related or work related, they may need some documentation of that. And they do want to contact Social Security and notify them. You know, I'm working, this is how much my earnings are. They definitely need to report their earnings to Social Security, but they also want to report potential impairment related work expenses. And they're not official until Social Security approves them. So that's something a person would do with the help of a benefits planner to report that stuff to Social Security. And they do want to keep documentation. Good question. So then we're going to move on to the last work incentive that we're covering in detail in this training. And that's called PASS, Plan to Achieve Self-Support. So a plan to achieve self-support is a plan that helps a person reach a work goal. So the first step in a PASS is to have a work goal. I want to be a full-time scientist, or I want to be a self-employed choreographer, whatever it might be. And the PASS helps a person reach the goal by helping them pay for expenses needed to reach the goal. How does it help them pay for expenses to reach the goal? By enabling them to get more SSI using the PASS than they would get without the PASS. So the higher SSI payments help to offset the out-of-pocket costs the person needs to pay for to reach the goal. So PASS expenses are subtracted from countable income. Countable income goes down, SSI goes up. So what kinds of expenses can a person pay for with the help of a PASS? Well, an expense has to meet 4 conditions to be allowed under a PASS. It has to be paid for by the person with a disability and not reimbursed. That should ring a bell. That's also a condition for IRWE. It has to be needed to reach the work goal. This is a little different from IRWE. With IRWE, the expense had to be needed at least partly for work, for the current work the person was doing. For a PASS, it has to be needed to reach the work goal, which may not be work the person is currently doing. 3, it has to be a new or additional expense. In other words, something that the person wasn't paying for before the PASS, or maybe something that they were paying for before the PASS, but now they have to pay more for it. An example would be person pays for attendance services. Before they started work and started their PASS, they were paying for 5 hours a week of attendance services. Now that they're working, they need 15 hours a week. The original 5 hours a week they paid for would not be a PASS expense, but the additional 10 hours a week they need to pay for to be able to work and pursue their goal could be a PASS expense. That would be an additional expense. And number 4, it generally has to be a startup cost, not a long-term continuing expense. But there are exceptions, like car payments, paying for job coaching if you're using a pass for that, and some others. So
Hey, Mike.
yes,
Sorry, Sandy. So I'm just
yes,
wanting to
Sandy.
kind of jump in on ask a follow-up question with something that you mentioned about it has to be a new expense or additional expense.
Mhm.
What if somebody has been paying for it but struggling? So I'm thinking of somebody who may be taking coursework to get certification, but they're struggling. They've got a high debt that they are now having to pay. So, let's say in order to finish up and register for the next semester, they have to get their bill up to date. And they're struggling. Is that something that maybe we could say, hey, this may be where PASS can help you out if you're struggling, you're not being able to meet that debt. And maybe by using the PASS, then it's like now they are able to pay for their class and move forward.
Yes. Yes, Sandy, that's a great example. So if a person is already pursuing a work goal, and there's a question in the chat about what constitutes a work goal, and I will answer that in a moment. And that was from Jordan. If a person's already pursuing a work goal, like they're involved in education or training to reach a work goal, and they're paying for it out of their own pocket and they're not using a pass, but it appears they would be eligible for a pass, they could, in midstream, submit a pass and say, well, I'm pursuing education in order to reach a work goal, but I can't afford the education expenses without a pass. So I'm submitting a pass to be able to afford those expenses. That could be allowed. And in some cases, if a person has been eligible during a retroactive period, they've been getting SSI, they've been pursuing their goal, they've been paying for expenses, a pass could be used retroactively up to 12 months. So what constitutes a work goal? Jordan asks. A work goal is very individualized. It depends on the individual's preferences and abilities. A work goal is specific. I gave a couple of specific examples. I want to be a full-time scientist, or I want to be a self-employed choreographer. Those would be examples. The work goal has to be a goal such that if the person reaches it in the long run after the pass, they will be less dependent on cash benefits from Social Security. So in the case of SSI, if a person starts out on SSI, if they reach the work goal after the pass, they'll be getting significantly less SSI than the amount they started out with, or possibly zero SSI. Okay. We're also going to talk about pass used by people who get SSDI rather than SSI, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. But the pass is an individualized goal, and if the person reaches the goal, they will be significantly less dependent on cash benefits from Social Security. And Sandy adds, it also has to be considered attainable, meaning there's a good chance the person could achieve it. Right. You do have to submit a pass to Social Security, and they have to agree that the goal would also be feasible for the individual to reach. So examples of pass expenses: job coaching or paying a coworker for support, transportation costs pretty much across the board, even including buying and insuring a car and covering work-related mileage at that IRS mileage rate that we talked about. Vehicle modifications are also allowed. So as you can imagine, one popular expense to use a pass for is to buy a car. Education expenses, tuition, books, fees, tutoring if needed, all to reach the work goal. Amber asks, so if I start a job and go into the disability office to report it, do I tell them I want to do pass or the 9-month trial period? Okay, so Amber, if you get SSI, only SSI to begin with, let's say $914 a month, the maximum for an unmarried individual, and you start a job and you go into the Social Security office, or you just contact the Social Security office, you do want to report that you're working, give them information about your job and your earnings. And without a pass or IRWE, what they'll do is reduce your SSI. Generally 2 months later after you get your first paycheck. But it won't be reduced dollar for dollar. If instead you tell Social Security, I want to use a pass because right now I'm working part-time, but my goal is to work full-time and I need to pay for certain expenses to reach that full-time goal. And here's my goal. Here are the steps I need to complete to reach my goal. And here are the expenses I need to pay for to reach the goal. That's the foundation of a pass. And then the person could use the pass to keep more of their SSI, possibly the maximum, while they're working to help offset the out-of-pocket expenses. But there is no trial work period for SSI. That's only for SSDI. Okay. Also, with SSI, after a person's getting SSI, substantial gainful activity, SGA, is no longer an issue for them. It is for people on SSDI. Okay. So SGA and trial work period are big issues for people on SSDI. For people on SSI, there's no trial work period. And if you're working after you start getting SSI, SGA doesn't matter. And Sandy reminds us, do refer people to a benefits planner, especially if they want to do something like a pass. So other examples of pass expenses: job-related equipment, tools, uniforms, computers, childcare if needed to be able to work or complete training or education to work, expenses to start a business. You can use a pass not just to reach a goal of employment, could be used for self-employment, assistive technology, attendance services, and lots of others that meet those 4 conditions we looked at a little earlier. So let's look at a pass example. And this is Laura, who gets $914 a month SSI, the maximum for an unmarried person. She starts a part-time job earning $1,685 a month gross wages. She'd like to get a full-time job as an HVAC technician, but all the available jobs for those technicians require her to have her own car. So she needs to pay $800 a month for a car payment, insurance, and mileage for full-time work. So she can use a pass. She has a goal. Her goal is to be a full-time HVAC technician, earning a lot more than the $1,685 a month she's earning working part-time now. She reaches that goal, it will probably reduce her SSI payments to 0. And she's got expenses she needs to pay for to reach that goal. She needs a car to be an HVAC technician. Okay, All right. Now let's take a look again at our spreadsheet, our SSI calculation sheet. Okay, and if you're using your sheet, please follow me along here. We're going to change the earned income to 1,685. That's how much she's earning. And we had a $200 IRWE on line 15. Let's change that $200 to 0. And now we'll see how much SSI she should get without using a pass or IRWE. And that would be $114 a month that you see on line 30. And her net pre-tax income on line 37 would be $1,799 a month. But now we said that she is paying $800 a month for car expenses through a pass. If you look at line 24, you'll see plan to achieve self-support pass. That's where we put the pass expenses. So on line 24, column B or column 2, you can go ahead and enter $800. The pass expenses get subtracted from the countable income. And now the countable income, total countable income on line 26 is 0. Subtracting 0 from the $914 maximum SSI means her SSI payment will be $914 a month rather than $114 a month. So what's her net income going to be, her net pre-tax income? Well, to figure it, we've got her earned income on line 33, the $1,685, plus her SSI payment of $914, minus the $800 in work-related expenses, the car expenses she's paying for, and her net pre-tax income is $1,799 a month, exactly the same amount it was when she was working and not using a pass and not paying for a car. So her net income is the same with the pass as without it, but with the pass, she gets a car. Without the pass, she's got no car. So the pass is offsetting her expenses dollar for dollar in this example. Okay, and we're running a bit short on time, so I'm just going to be answering questions rather than replying to other comments in the chat. Forgive me, but Amber asks, so if I start a job and go into the disability, no, I'm sorry, that's an old one. Do we have any new ones? Amber asks, where can we find a benefits planner? I will get to that. A little later, Karen asks, what if someone's monthly SSDI is a smaller amount, say $600? Would or should they also receive SSI to make up to the amount of the current SSI monthly amount? If so, then how do these PASS or IRWE programs work for them? Yeah, I am going to give an example of a person on SSDI using a PASS in a moment, Karen, but you're right. I won't have time to talk about what happens with a person who gets both SSDI and SSI today. Yeah, I apologize for that. So let's get back to the PowerPoint. And So Laura's net pre-tax income with the pass is the same as without it, $17.99 a month. But with the pass, she gets a car. So if a person has only SSI and earned income from work, the pass will usually offset 100% of the amount of their expenses. So if they paid $200 for a pass expense, they'd get to keep $200 more SSI than they would without the pass. That's similar to BWE, as we looked at earlier. And for Laura, she paid $800 a month for car expenses, got to keep $800 a month more SSI that offset the car expenses dollar for dollar. But a person who gets too much SSDI to get any SSI can also use a pass to qualify for SSI. And I'm going to show you how that works on the SSI calculation in a moment. Okay, and Sandy answered Karen's question. So I want to go back to the SSI calculation sheet for a moment. Okay, so I'm going to clean up the sheet, change the earned income to 0, change the pass expenses to 0. Now we have a clean sheet. Suppose a person got $933 a month of SSDI. That would be unearned income. That goes on line 4. Their countable unearned income would be $913 a month. And if you scroll down to the SSI payment on line 30, you'll see they would get $1 of SSI. So if you get less than $934 a month of unearned income like SSDI, you can still get a little bit of SSI. But if the unearned income was $934 a month or more, the SSI amount would be 0. All right. So this is why some people get both SSDI and SSI. If their SSDI is less than $934 a month, they can still get some SSI as well. Okay. Back to the PowerPoint. A pass can be used for a person who gets too much SSDI to get SSI, namely 934 or more a month SSDI. They can actually use a pass to qualify for SSI. The example we'll go through is Mark, who gets $960 a month SSDI. That's more than $933 a month, which means his SSDI income is too high for him to get SSI. But Mark has a goal. He wants to work full-time as a barber, needs to pay for barber school, which will cost him $900 a month for 18 months. And once he finishes barber school, he'll then be able to get a job as a barber. So could he use a pass? He can. He has income that would reduce his SSI or make him ineligible for SSI without a pass, getting too much SSDI to get any SSI. He has a goal to be a full-time barber. He has an expense he needs to pay for to reach the goal. So he can use a pass. And what we can do is go back to the spreadsheet, and they want to do this along with me. And so we're going to take his unearned income, his SSDI, make that the $960 a month he receives. That makes his countable unearned income $940. And when you scroll down to the SSI payment, his SSI payment would be 0 on line 30. Why? Because you started with the 914 SSI base rate on line 28. His total countable income on line 29 is more than the 914. When you subtract that from the 914, it brings his SSI payment down to 0. So without a pass, Mark is not eligible for any SSI. His net pre-tax income is $960 a month, the amount of his SSDI. But when Mark uses the pass to pay $900 a month for barber school, his pass expense is $900 on line 24. Go ahead and enter that. That reduces his total countable income to $40 a month. The pass expense of $900 is subtracted from the countable income of $940. And now he'll get an SSI payment of $874 a month on line 30, because his SSI is only reduced by $40 a month, his countable income. So now how much net income does he have? Well, he's got on line 32, the $960 unearned income, his SSDI, plus his SSI payment with the pass of $874, minus the $900 a month he's paying for barber school. His net pre-tax income is $934 a month. Daniel asks, this is so great. Can anyone on SSDI do this? Potentially, but in reality, people with higher amounts of SSDI may not be able to afford to do this, Daniel, and I'll explain why in a moment here. So remember that Mark's net pre-tax income without pass was $960 a month. His net pre-tax income with the pass and paying for barber school is $934 a month. Going back to our PowerPoint, what we see is that he's got less net income to live on with the pass than without it. But it's only $26 a month less, $934 rather than $960. So if he could cut his living expenses by $26 a month, he could afford this pass. But let's say his SSDI benefit was a lot higher than $960 a month. If he used a pass, his net pre-tax income, you could play around with the spreadsheet to figure this out, would end up being $934 a month. The person gets only SSDI and they're using a pass, their net pre-tax income is always going to be $934 a month. But if the person's SSDI was, let's say, $1,300 a month, would they be able to afford their living expenses with only $934 a month? Probably not. If that person on SSDI also went to work, maybe part-time, then their net income with the pass might be high enough to cover their living expenses. Then they could use a pass even with relatively high amounts of SSDI, but that's really kind of beyond the scope of our training. But potentially a person on SSDI can use a pass, but with amounts of SSDI that are relatively high, it probably wouldn't work because they wouldn't have enough money to live on. So if a person's interested in a pass, how can they prepare one and submit it to Social Security? They're going to want to get help, probably from a benefits planner. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, I wanted to give you a few resources that are specific to pass on slide 44. The person can complete or start completing the pass application form. And that's the first link on slide 44. There's a great website to use to help prepare a pass called Pass Online. That's the second link on this slide. The person who reviews and approves passes submitted anywhere in Missouri is Kate Rader at Social Security, and her phone number and email address are found on this slide. And if a person gets only SSDI, not any SSI, and they use a pass to qualify for SSI, like Mark did in the example, then they need to apply for SSI at the same time that they submit the pass, because it's the pass being approved that will qualify them for SSI. So how can a person get help using IRWE or PASS or subsidy or line work expenses, any of the work incentives that we talked about? They can contact a benefit planner or somebody called a CWIC, a Community Work Incentive Coordinator. So the person is getting services from an agency that has a benefit planner on staff person who's been through training and certification from Cornell University or Virginia Commonwealth University. They can connect with that person. If not, if the agency doesn't have any benefit planners, the person's not connected with an agency, they can call the Ticket to Work helpline, 866-968-7842, and ask to be referred to the WIPA project. That's WIPA stands for Work Incentives Planning and Assistance. And they will provide free benefits planning through a certified person called a Community Work Incentive Coordinator, or CWIC for short. So you always want to refer a person who's working or pursuing work, interested in work, gets benefits from Social Security to a benefits planner or a Community Work Incentive Coordinator. So just a few quick comparisons of using IRWE and PASS to fund work-related expenses. So IRWEs are expenses that are needed because of disability or medical condition and needed at least partly for work. PASS expenses don't have to be related to disability or medical condition, but they do need to be needed to pursue a work goal, to achieve a work goal. IRWE, used for SSDI, is used to reduce countable income, subtract from earnings, to keep countable income below SGA and keep the full SSDI benefit. And that extra income the person gets from earning more than the SGA dollar amount helps to offset those expenses. IRWE can help a person earn more than they thought they could, so they'll have higher income to be able to better afford those expenses. Also, it lets people accept more hours at work, raises, etc., that they might otherwise refuse for fear of losing SSDI. What about for SSI? For SSI, you can use IRWEs, but they usually offset only half the expense. So it's not going to help the person pay for the full cost of an expense if they couldn't afford to have their net income go down at all. But if the person has to pay for the expense out of pocket either way, using IRWE will be helpful because it'll let them get some SSI to help offset at least half the expense. PASS, on the other hand, will usually offset 100% of expenses if the person gets only SSI and earnings from work. But PASS can also be used by a person who gets only SSDI or who has only SSDI and earnings from work, but not SSI. PASS could let them qualify for SSI. And the PASS helps offset the expenses to reach the work goal. And my apologies, we are out of time, but I will stick around if anyone cares to stay longer. I know there was a detailed question earlier about CDB, the Childhood Disability Benefit. I'm happy to answer that one. And I'm going to look in the chat, see if there are questions I haven't answered. Okay.
Mike, there was one from, I believe her name was Ruth, about sheltered employment and if there's any benefit limitations based on sheltered employment. I did make a response, but I would love to hear from Ruth if that answered what she was looking for, or if she wants more details that maybe you can kind of then touch upon.
Sure. Well, without seeing your answer, Sandy, I'll just answer briefly that sheltered workshop earnings count as earnings for SSI purposes, just like earnings in competitive integrated employment do. So, so there's really no difference in how sheltered workshop earnings count for SSI purposes. For SSDI purposes, sheltered workshop earnings are considered, but sheltered workshop earnings are less likely to be considered substantial gainful activity, or SGA. And sometimes, actually most of the time, sheltered workshop earnings are less than a person would be earning in competitive integrated employment, pretty much all the time. So that's one way that sheltered workshop earnings help keep earnings below SGA, because people just don't get as much. And if a person is on the higher end of the wage scale in their sheltered workshop, they may be able to use a subsidy if their earnings are not already adjusted for reduced productivity. So they could potentially use a subsidy, which means there would be a subtraction after they'd received earnings. There'd be a subtraction from their earnings. They could also use impairment related work expenses if they had them. Okay. Thank you, Robin. And if there are any other questions, please feel free to type them into the chat if you're still on. And if the person who asked the question about the CDB benefit in marriage is still on. Oh, you're welcome, John. That it was Jennifer. Okay, great. You're still on. Let me go back to your question, Jennifer. Okay, I'm going to read it. If an adult child is determined ineligible for CDB on one parent's work record, say because the adult child got married, can they later try to reapply for CDB if they're no longer married? If yes, can they reapply under the same parent, or do they have to reapply under the other parent's Social Security number? You know, Jennifer, reading through your question again, I don't want to answer this one off the cuff. I want to check the POMS, the Program Operation Manual System, which you're probably familiar with already, if you asked such a detailed question. But I'll look that up and I'll get back to you. Okay. If you wouldn't mind just typing your email into the chat, Jennifer, then I'll go ahead and note it, and I'll be happy to get back to you with an answer after I've verified it. Okay, great. All right. And if there are no additional questions, then I think we will call it a day.
Michael, I'm not seeing any more questions, but lots of accolades for you for the great training and that you just powered through for 2 hours. When you said you were going to check the palms, I thought you were talking about palm reading for a minute, but you know those details. So everyone, thank you so much. Great participation, great questions. Mike, we're just so appreciative that you're such a wonderful teacher and break things down and really respond to everyone's questions directly. So thank you for your time. And thank you so much to the Behavioral Council for sponsoring this event along with MODDC.
Well, thank you very much for your help and for all the work you did to organize this and for inspiring the training in the first place, Stacy. I also want to give special thanks to Sandy Kaiser, who, as you've gathered, if you weren't already familiar with Sandy, is quite an expert herself in answering a lot of questions and posing some additional information in the chat. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your week and weekend. And I do want to ask you to do one thing, which is do try this at home. So in other words, don't give people information without conferring with a benefit planner. Remember, it's the benefit planner who goes into the details, but you do want to let people know that, gee, you know, I've heard you can earn more than this SGA dollar amount if you're paying for these expenses called impairment related work expenses, where I've heard that you can keep more of your SSI while working and use that extra money to offset expenses to reach a work goal. Why don't we look into this? So you should now have enough information to know what issues to look at and what questions to ask. But always want to refer people to benefit planners. So thank you all again. And I really enjoyed this.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
So Mike and Stacy, just to let you know, I think the majority of people who are attending were at least benefits planners, if not CWICs. So that was great that our messaging, we targeted those individuals to go in a little bit deeper